Hello, my name is Ian Larkin. I'm a professor of management at UCLA, and I teach business strategy and human resource management to MBA students and executives. Today we're going to be talking about organizations. And the first question we're going to ask is, what is an organization? It may seem like a very simple question, but it's actually one that has stumped economists and management scholars for quite a long time. It's probably obvious to you that organizations are about coordinating resources and actions of people and raw materials. But there's other ways to coordinate those same actions. Markets, for example. Markets where people are free to buy and sell from whoever they want. A lot of activities that take place in organizations actually could alternatively take place in a market. You might procure an input from somebody else within your organization that makes that input, but another firm might choose to buy that same input from a separate company via a market. And so markets and organizations are actually alternative ways to coordinate resources and actions. And if we think about the characteristics of these two choices around coordination, we can see how different they are. What dictates how the coordination actually occurs? How do actions and decisions get made by actors within organizations and markets? Well, think about how you decide in a market who you're going to transact with. A lot of it is based on the price. In fact, the price mechanism is the fundamental method by which actions are coordinated within markets. How about within a firm? If someone comes to you and says, I'd like you to fill out this document or carry out this task, you usually don't say, well, I'll do it for you, but only if you pay me $5. There isn't a price mechanism within a firm. Instead, you have to listen to your manager, and your manager coordinates actions within the firm. And so markets and organizations are different in terms of how actions are coordinated. They're also different in how strong authority is. Within a market, you're free to transact with whoever you'd like, and you can walk away if at any time you don't feel happy. Within an organization, yes, you can walk away, but that means leaving the firm altogether. A manager has a high degree of discretion to tell you what to do. And as you all know, you oftentimes within an organization will carry out some transaction or an action that you really didn't want to do. You never do that in a market. In a market, you just walk away. But managers have authority within organizations to tell you to do things that you don't want. A third way in which markets and organizations are different is the length of relationships and the length of the transactions. When I go buy a cup of coffee in the morning, that only takes a few seconds, and I don't have to go to the same coffee store every time. You have short-lived transactions within markets. Within organizations, workers are typically in an organization for years, working with the same people and having to build relationships with those people. And so you have very long-lived transactions and relationships within organizations. And so although markets and organizations are carrying out the same tasks, they are operating in fundamentally different ways. Understanding how to most optimally operate an organization is very difficult, but it's very, very important for managers, be they managers in big firms or managers in entrepreneurship type situations working with small firms. In fact, as we're going to see, managing organizations is very, very difficult. It involves a lot of difficult choices. And entrepreneurs oftentimes have outstanding products which would do extremely well on the market, but an entrepreneur who is very technically savvy may not understand how to manage his or her organization and can fail because she does a bad job at the management. Actually, research has shown that entrepreneurship success is more determined by managerial skill than it is by technical skill. And that's why understanding organizations and how to manage them is so important. And so let's get into this question of how to optimally manage organizations. We first want to understand, what do organizations do? What is their purpose? And let's go back to first principles and think about, what actions do organizations fundamentally carry out? Well, any organization first is going to take a set of inputs, raw materials, and then an organization is going to transform them in some way through labor, through the use of capital equipment, through R&D, research and development. They are going to transform the inputs, and all of these actions are costly. And so there's a cost to transform the inputs. So an organization's total cost is the cost of its inputs, its input costs or raw materials costs, and then the cost to transform the inputs. Why would a firm do this in the first place? Well, by transforming the inputs, they create value. And how do they create value? They find customers who are willing to pay more for their transformed product than the cost it takes them to produce the product. So the total value created by the organization is the difference between the two. The difference between the willingness to pay that customers have, which is defined as the maximum amount a customer would spend on your product, and the total cost that you incur to create that product, which again is your input cost and the transformation cost that your organization spends. So the rationale for organizations is to create value by transforming inputs in a way that makes those inputs even more valuable to customers than the cost you incurred to make the transformation. So again, the basic formula is that willingness to pay, which is the maximum a customer would spend on your product, minus the total cost to the organization, which is the cost of your inputs, and the cost of your transformation is the total value that you create. Now, value creation is not the same thing as value capture. It's not the same thing as profitability. And a lot of organizations make mistakes when they don't think about the two differently. Let's talk about the division of value created by a firm. Some of the value that you create is probably going to go to your consumers. Why is that? Because it's actually rare for organizations to be able to price at a customer's willingness to pay. A lot of times, for competitive reasons, you have to lower your price below a consumer's willingness to pay, or you might not even know how much they're willing to pay. And so you charge a price which is below willingness to pay. And that means the consumer, the customer, captures some of the value. And we call that consumer surplus. And that's the value that the consumer gets, the difference between willingness to pay and the price charged. Your organization is creating value, but you're giving some of that to consumers. And we've already talked about the fact that organizations have to spend money, incur costs to transform the inputs. You can think about the cost of your organization as the difference between total cost and input cost. And that's just the cost to transform your raw materials into your product. So that's not value created, that's actually a cost that organizations spend. So firms' profits are only price minus total costs. The amount of value captured by your organization is the price you charge minus the sum of your costs. So organizations create value, but they aren't capturing all of the value that they create. What should a firm's objective be? Well, of course, it should be to capture as much value as possible. But we want you to think about it on a little bit of a different level. Let's think about why. Let's think about what a firm should try and maximize. What makes a firm successful? We'll do this through an example firm. Let's look at firm 1 that has willingness to pay, price, total costs, and input costs, as you see on the screen. If firm 1 is competing with the firm 2 that has a different willingness to pay, price, and total cost, but the same input costs, which firm do you think is going to be more successful in the marketplace and why? And you can see the two firms are different. Firm 2 has a smaller organizational cost. Its total costs are lower, but it also has a lower willingness to pay than firm 1. Its products are not thought to be as good on the marketplace. You might think this means firm 2 isn't going to be successful. But let's think about whether that makes sense. Which product do you think a customer is more likely to buy? Well, customers don't buy the product for which they have the highest willingness to pay. Customers care about their surplus. They care about the difference between willingness to pay and price. And so when a customer is making a decision about the product to buy, they are not thinking about what they're willing to pay the most for. They're thinking about what gives them the most value, the biggest surplus. And as you can see, firm 2's consumer surplus is bigger than firm 1's. And so firm 2 is going to be the one that customers choose. Now, some of you are probably thinking very strategically, aha, if that's true, firm 1 can just lower its price, right? And if firm 1 lowers its price down to here, it's offering an even bigger surplus than firm 2 is. And so firm 1 is going to succeed. And you'd be exactly right, except firm 2 can then respond by lowering its price even more. And so what determines which firm is going to be the most successful? Well, we have to assume that firms can only price down to their total cost. They're not going to take a loss on a product. And so the floor on the price is the total cost. Firm 1 could lower its price all the way down to its total costs. If it did that, Firm 2 would still be able to lower its price even lower and offer a greater consumer surplus and have a little bit of profit left over for itself. And so which firm is going to win? The firm that has the biggest wedge between willingness to pay and total cost. And what is willingness to pay minus total cost? Well, that's our measure of total value. And that comes to our fundamental objective of firms, which is to create the most value. Successful organizations are defined by driving the biggest wedge between willingness to pay and total cost. That gap is what determines organizational success. Firm 2 is going to be more successful than Firm 1 because Firm 1 has a smaller amount of value created. Its willingness to pay minus total cost gap is smaller than Firm 2. So let's think about a third firm then. Firm 3. You can see it has a higher willingness to pay than Firm 2, but also a higher total cost. Its organizational costs are bigger, but its willingness to pay is too. Which is going to be successful, Firm 2 or Firm 3? Well, again, if you compare the total value created by the two firms, you'd see that Firm 3 has a bigger gap. And therefore, no matter what Firm 2 does with its prices, Firm 3 can still outcompete. Organizations are defined by the amount of value that they create. The organization that creates the most value is going to win in the marketplace. The fundamental objective of organizations is to create value. And organizations that create value, in the end, are going to capture the most value. So again, to be a successful organization, you need to drive as big of a gap as possible between willingness to pay and cost. This is very difficult though. Driving a wedge between willingness to pay and total cost is not as easy as it seems. How come? Well, let's say your CEO comes to you and says, I'd like you to focus on increasing willingness to pay for our product. What are you going to tell him or her you're going to do specifically? Probably steps like, let's increase the quality of our product, or let's add a functionality, increase the number of attributes, or let's spend a lot of money on branding, on advertising. All of those steps might increase the willingness to pay of your product, but all of them are costly, and it's going to increase the total cost to your organizations as well. What if your CEO comes and says the opposite? We really need to focus on decreasing costs. If you think about methods to do that, it's just the opposite of the steps you take to increase willingness to pay. Let's use cheaper raw materials, or let's take out functionality from our product that's expensive, or let's reduce our advertising. Those will all reduce your costs, but they'll also reduce your willingness to pay. Organizations need to understand that increasing the total amount of value that they create involves trade-offs. You can't increase willingness to pay and decrease costs at the same time. You can only pursue one of the objectives, increasing willingness to pay by more than you increase your costs, or decreasing your willingness to pay by less than you decrease your costs. Organizations involve trade-offs. Firms with higher willingness to pay inevitably have higher costs, and firms with lower willingness to pay have lower organizational costs. There's no free lunch when it comes to organizations, and that's why managing organizations is difficult. In theory and in practice, organizations are fundamentally about understanding and navigating the trade-offs involved in creating value. So to summarize, organizations are fundamentally about coordinating resources through managerial authority. They add value by transforming inputs, but this transformation and this addition of value to inputs involves trade-offs. Increasing willingness to pay is costly, and if you reduce costs, you're going to decrease your willingness to pay. Looking ahead, now that we understand what organizations are, we're going to move on to the question of how big should an organization be?